Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Untangle Tech Talk webinar series. Today, we'll be going through our product, NG Firewall, and all of the advanced networking capabilities within the product. My name is Shannon Bonfiglio. I'm part of the marketing team here at Untangle, and I'll be your host today. I have with us Eric Newvine, who's one of our sales engineers, and he'll be taking us through this presentation and a deep dive into the product. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. Please be sure you're selecting the correct audio preference. On the right-hand side, you'll see the option to use telephone or your computer speakers. If you do select to use your computer speakers, please make sure you have a strong internet connection so you're able to listen to this throughout. If you do select to use the phone, you will need to use the access code that's provided. As always, all of our webinars are recorded, so you'll be able to rewatch or revisit any areas that you want to follow up on later on. The webinar will be posted on the Untangle YouTube channel within 24 hours this has ended. And as always, please submit any questions you may have in the questions panel on the right-hand side. We have a few staff members on hand that will be happy to assist in answering those questions, as well as I'll be working with Eric to live answer some questions as well. If you have a very specific question though, in terms of your setup, I would suggest sending an email to support@untangle.com or sales@untangle.com, just so that, or post it on the forums, the Untangle forums. That might be a better way to get your question answered than in this webinar. And I believe that's it, so I'll pass it over to Eric.
Thanks, Shannon. So today we're going to talk about some advanced networking concepts and some common scenarios involved with when an advanced network setup may be required. Some things that we're going to be covering: port forwards, whether it's port forwards from a single device to to a number of different port forwards for various services that are being hosted on your network. We'll also be talking about NAT and creating NAT rules for multiple IPs that are assigned both on your external interface as well as the different devices in your network. We'll talk a little bit about VoIP and how that should be configured in the Untangle product. We'll be talking about high availability, how we utilize that technology in our product, and we'll also talk about VLANs. Port forwarding. The most common use case for port forwards is when you have a service that's being hosted on your local network that needs to have access from the outside world. Common use cases here are web servers, mail servers, vendors hosted devices that are on your network that they need to have access to provide the service that they do. All of those things require a port forward in order for that level of access to work. In many cases, you may have just one single public IP address, external interface, but you may have several different devices that need, in some cases, the same ports or same services and protocols that are required to actually deliver everything that you need to have accessible to the outside world. When you create a port forward on the Untangle, there's a couple of different ways that you can do it. We have what we refer to as simple, and we also have advanced. We default to the simple setup, where you give the rule a description, you select the protocol, and you select the port from a predefined set of lists, or it's a predefined list of ports. In that list is also a custom or other, where you can manually type in a port if you need to. And then, of course, you specify the new destination for where it's going to go on the local network. If you switch to the advanced rule option, you can add additional conditions to that rule. So it's not restricted to just traffic coming in on your any external interface to wherever you tell it to go. You can do things like specifying only specific source addresses can access, or you can specify if you have multiple WANs, you can have it only work on a specific WAN interface, or if you have one WAN with multiple IP aliases tied to it, you can specify that specific alias so that they don't have access to all of your IP addresses. Some important things to keep in mind when you're creating a port forward, especially when you're in advanced mode, is you might want to lean towards, more conditions means it's going to be more specific and more secure and work better. But in actuality, the simpler you can make that rule, the easier it is to troubleshoot if it ends up not working the way you expect it to. There are a lot of cases where, yes, you do need to have several conditions for a rule to work properly, but any condition that you can leave out in a rule will make it that much simpler later when you come back to look at it to try to figure out why it's not working the way you expect. Another important aspect when you create a port forward is, remember, you're creating a hole into your network through the firewall. So you need to make sure that when you're doing that, if you only need specific access to a specific service, that you delineate that in the rule when you're creating it. Great example of that is services like remote desktop, where you have an admin who's on the road and doesn't have access to the local office while they're out, but when they're having trouble, they need still to be able to get into the network, and not only get to the network, but also be able to then jump to whatever machine's having trouble. RDP is a great way to do that because it's built into the Windows operating system by default, and you can use it in other OSs as well. So in that case, you don't necessarily want RDP open to everybody because that gives them direct access to a device on your network. So in that case, like I said before, you can specify source address. You can specify an alias instead of the public IP. There's lots of different ways that you can make sure that you stay secure even though you are opening that hole in the firewall. Some other ways that you can do port forwarding well, not even necessarily to do the port forward, but more importantly, to make sure that a port forward works the way that you intend it to when it's created. You can create a port forward in such a way that it would apply both to inbound traffic as well as outbound traffic. And you may not want that to happen. A really good way to get around doing that is to utilize the DNS server tab in Config Network and create local DNS entries on the Untangle so that when a device is trying to go to a given host name that's actually being hosted on your local network, it doesn't have to go out through the Untangle, resolve, then come back in again. Instead, it can just automatically resolve to the local machine. A great tool for when you're trying to troubleshoot a port forward is our sessions viewer. The sessions viewer, if you can see in the screenshot up here, is right at the top of every screen. There's also lots of reports that you can utilize that will help with this, as well as some troubleshooting utilities that we'll talk about later on in this webinar. Moving on for port forwards to look at NAT. NAT and port forwards actually, in a lot of cases, go hand in hand. NAT is used to dictate what IP address to use when traffic is traversing out of your network to the external world. While there are several use cases for why you may want to do that, some of the most common ones tie directly into a port forward. I'll use a mail server as an example. You have a mail server set up hosted on your local network, and you have your mail DNS records set up to point to a specific IP address, public IP address. When you're setting those DNS up, you have the option, and you really should be taking advantage of that option, to only allow email from that specific public IP that you've specified. The problem that comes into play with that is, in a lot of cases, because it's being hosted locally behind a NATed device, the packets that get returned may not always match if you're using more than one public IP address on your external interface. And that's where NAT rules come into play. With a NAT rule, you can go in, you can specify the IP address of your mail server on the local network, and then you can tell it, I want to always have traffic coming from this IP address going out to the world to use a specific IP address, no matter what is the default on the Untangle. And that ensures that all of your traffic will be accepted by the rest of the world when they're doing those validation checks to make sure that you're not an invalid sender. There are some other things that you can do with NAT rules. You can NAT traffic by port. You can NAT traffic by interface. You can map by tags even. But again, the most common use case for doing this is when you need to have traffic be routed out in conjunction with port forwards. VoIP. VoIP phone systems are becoming more and more prevalent in the business world, and with that comes the additional workload to make sure that those systems work absolutely possibly can. When it comes to Untangle, there's a couple of things that we recommend that you do right off the bat. First thing, as soon as you get a phone system put in place. First thing is you make sure that you get that traffic bypassed. You do not want our apps, our layer 7 filtering protocols to interfere with that traffic in any way, shape, or form, because it will absolutely cause degradation of quality on that phone call. So when you're adding the phone system in, depending on whether it's hosted in the cloud or whether it's a locally sourced PBX or whatever it happens to be, come into the Untangle, go into config network, add a bypass rule, whether it's by ports or whether it's by IP address. Either way, make sure that you get that traffic bypassed. The other important thing to do along with that bypass is to also go into QoS, which is under advanced and then the QoS tab in config network, and create a rule for that traffic. And that rule can actually mimic what you've already set in the bypass rule. So, if you're using source address is, you can create a rule that's the same thing, source address is, and then you make sure that you set the priority to very high. That makes absolutely certain that that traffic always has the most access to the entire amount of bandwidth that is coming into your network. And that will in turn make sure that you get the best quality call possible through the Untangle. Some other things to help ease with the setup of a VoIP system. DHCP. In the Untangle, you have the ability in the DHCP server tab to go in and create static leases. Doing that will let you make absolutely certain that any rules that you put in place for those phones, for that PBX, whatever it happens to be, will always be applicable because the DHCP address will never change on that device. Moving from VoIP systems into VLANs. VLANs are interfaces, traffic, subnets that have been tagged with an 802.1q identifier to help with routing on your local network. With a VLAN, the Untangle by default does not have any VLANs built into it. However, it is very easy to come in and set up a VLAN on the Untangle. Go into config network on the interfaces tab. Right at the top of the screen here is an add tagged VLAN interface. This will bring up a screen that is very similar to what you see when you edit an interface. The only difference being that off to the right in the top right corner is that 802.1q tag field that I was talking about. And that's where you specify the tag that's being used on your VLAN switch behind the Untangle to define routing for that subnet. The other change from a standard interface is a VLAN needs to be tied to another interface, a physical interface on the Untangle. So in the majority of cases, you would set the parent to be an internal interface. You can set up a VLAN on an external interface, but the most common use cases are for local traffic. Some other things to keep in mind when we're talking about VLANs. Setting up the VLAN interface, again, is rather simple to do. majority of the routing and configuration for a VLAN is actually outside of the Untangle itself, so there's not a lot of configuring required for it. You can set up VLANs in bridge mode. That's a bit more complicated, and it's actually not something that we generally recommend if you can avoid it, simply because it does have the possibility of leading to some rather interesting and unexpected routing situations. But it can be done, and it will work. Essentially, when you're in bridge mode, you would have to set up a VLAN pair similar to what you were doing when you're just bridging two interfaces to each other. But that's the only significant difference. Some things to keep in mind when you're talking about wanting to create a VLAN on the Untangle is whether or not you actually need to have a VLAN tagged interface, or if you just need to define a static route so that you can identify traffic that the Untangle is seeing coming from it. If your VLAN is local only, it's actually terminating more than likely at your switch. So at that point, if we don't need to pass the tag to something else in front of us, we don't need to see the tag. And in that case, the only thing that we need is a route to define how to get to that subnet in the event that we get a packet, a session, that's destined for that network. High availability. Our high availability configuration actually utilizes a protocol called VRRP, which is Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol. Essentially what you do is you go into the Untangle on the interfaces, and on those interfaces that you want to be part of the high availability cluster, you would enable the VRRP settings, specify the priority and tag to identify that VRRP pair, specify your address, your virtual address, like we're talking about here, and then all of your machines on the local network, if you're doing it on the internal interfaces only, would point to the virtual address for routing. So as a default gateway, if we're the DHCP server or if we're at the gateway at the edge, instead of the actual IP that's assigned to the interface. And the reason for that is when we're in VRRP mode on an interface, we're sharing that virtual address between the two devices. So when the primary device fails, when the backup device takes over, it's still going to be broadcasting that virtual address. And then that way you can very quickly and easily get back online with the backup device without having to have to worry about going in and making configuration changes to the actual machines on your network. The other half of high availability actually utilizes some capabilities in our command center, which we're not going to get into in great detail in this particular session. But through that, you have the ability to also synchronize configurations between your two devices so that you have an almost seamless transition between those two systems. For more information about how to set up VRRP, we do have an excellent setup guide in our wiki, and that's linked here, as well as our knowledge base has additional information regarding it. By all means, as Shannon had said before at the beginning of the session, anytime you have a question about these sorts of things, don't hesitate, reach out. We know this stuff is difficult and complicated. That's why we're here. We want to help you. Dynamic routing. Recently, Untangle has added the capability to support additional routing protocols. We can do both BGP and OSPF routing, as well as the standard routing protocols that you're used to in the Untangle product. One key thing to keep in mind when we're talking about using BGP and OSPF, if you are using these protocols on your network, in order for them to pass through the Untangle, they do need to be enabled. Otherwise, we're going to drop them as invalid traffic. However, if you're looking to actually set up BGP or OSPF, doing so in the Untangle alone is probably not going to meet what you're looking for. We're intended more as a addition to an existing BGP routed network, not a way to create a BGP network. We can help, but not necessarily going to provide all the key pieces that you need to get that routing set up and functional across all of your devices. You need specific routers or switches along with our firewall to make that work the way that you expect it to. And with that, I'm going to switch over to our demo. And we'll take a look at how some of these things work in the product itself. Everything that we're talking about is contained within the config network screen section of the Untangle, whether it's port forwards, NAT rules, dynamic routing, what have you. They're all going to be here because they're all layer 3 protocols. So everything is going to be under config network. I'm going to touch on VLANs first, just simply because we're already in this screen. To create a tagged VLAN interface, you don't have to worry about which interface is selected here, by the way. I can select internal or external, it doesn't matter. You click the Add Tagged VLAN Interface, and like I said, it looks pretty similar to what you're used to seeing when you edit an interface. The primary difference being the parent interface and tag fields that are here. So we create an interface name. We're going to hang it off the internal interface. And like the name said, it's VLAN 10, so we're going to give that tag. And as you can see, you can set this up as a WAN interface. You can set this up for DHCP. You can set it up to use VRRP, just like you would on any other interface on the Untangle. The only difference is that tag. So once you've specified the IP address that you want to use, and the subnet mask, you're done. Click done, hit save, and you have a brand new VLAN interface that's in the device. I am using our demo unit, so I unfortunately can't save this to show you what it looks like. However, what you would see if we were to save this, I'm going to cancel this screen, is you would see an additional interface added here, and the device delineator here would be ETH1.10. That's how you can know the difference between a VLAN tagged interface versus a standard interface, because it'll have a ETH number dot and then another number. Port forwards, the main reason why I want to show this is to show the difference between simple, which is what we're seeing right now. As I said, all of these are all pre-filled out. Port does give you the option to specify a different port number that's not already listed, but that's it. That's all that you have in simple mode. When you switch to advanced, you have the ability to add and remove many, many more conditions than what you can in simple. Some key pointers here to point out. This destined local condition. This is the default condition that's used in simple mode, mainly because what destined local means is literally any IP address that is defined on an interface on the Untangle itself. So if it matches the internal interface or the external interface or your DMZ interface, it doesn't matter. As long as the destination address matches something that is defined on an interface, it'll match. And that's where the DNS entries we were talking about earlier in the example really comes into play and is important, because it's going to try to match that no matter where it's coming from. You do have the option, of course, to not use destined local and instead use destination address. And this might seem a little confusing when you're first looking at it, because when you're thinking destination address, you're actually thinking this, the new destination, where it's going. But in this particular case, what we're talking about is the destination for the packet that's being requested. So if I'm out in some other part of the world and I'm trying to connect to my home network, my destination address is going to be my public IP at home. So the destination address is actually your public IP on an external interface. So in this case, you would specify a destination address, you would type in the IP address that you're interested in. And then only traffic that's coming to the Untangle on that specific IP address will match this port forward rule. And that's an excellent way to help secure your protocols as they're coming into the network. And we can do 3389 and I don't know, let's do 389 and 636. So RDP and LDAP. And we're going to send that to my internal AD server. You may need to have that for services to work properly, but you certainly don't want that open to the entire world. So that's when destination address condition comes in handy, as well as source address. Source address lets you specify where the traffic is coming from. So then you can only connect to it if you're from a known source. NAT rules, we did look at this kind of briefly in the slide earlier, but I do want to look at it again now just so you can kind of get a feel for how creating a NAT rule looks. It's pretty similar to creating a port forward. The only difference is instead of a new destination and port, you're telling it what IP you want to send the traffic out on. You have the same list of conditions with the exception of destined local. Because obviously that is never going to be a valid session or a valid condition for a NAT rule. So you can say source address is 92.168.10.12, for example. And I want this traffic to go through a specific IP address that I have defined on my external interface, and not necessarily the one that is my, for lack of a better term, primary IP address, the one that is explicitly defined on the interface itself. You can use any alias that's listed there. So I can do 12.33.87, for example. That's not the IP address that's on my external interface, but I do have it defined as an alias, so it's valid. So now all traffic exiting the Untangle outbound will NAT from 10.12 to the 54.87 public IP. Like I said before, that is extremely useful, especially in cases where you have public-facing DNS entries, DNS records for your services, because those all require quite a bit of validation in order for the recipient to actually be able to receive what you're sending them, or what they've requested, depending on the service, of course. Wanted to touch briefly on bypass rules just to kind of give you a feel for what's already there by default on the Untangle. This is the default set of bypass rules. And as you can see, we do already have 2 bypass rules there turned on as soon as you install the Untangle. Both of those have to do with VoIP protocols. They happen to be 2 of the more common ones. That is certainly not the end all be all for setting up VoIP. You can set up VoIP service on almost any IP address using UDP and or TCP, depending on the service provider. Having these rules enabled doesn't hurt anything, of course, but you want to make absolutely certain that every single port being used by your VoIP provider is included in that bypass rule. And you can do that in a couple of ways. You can either create a brand new bypass rule specifically for your VoIP service, or you can just modify the existing VoIP sessions rule and add in your other ports. So let's say, for example, that you have ports 10,000 through 11,000. you now have both port 5060 and the range 10,000 to 11,000 bypassed in this rule. And you can add several different port ranges or individual port numbers in this rule so that they're all going to be bypassed. And then the other half of what we were talking about with VoIP was, of course, the QoS rules. We don't have it configured here on this one, but you can still see how the rules work. You'll see here that we've got a rule already in place that sets ports 5060 and 5061 to very high priority. What that's going to do is it's going to make absolutely certain that that traffic gets access to 100% of your entire bandwidth pipe coming into the building. I'm going to switch back to interfaces real quick just to show the VRRP configuration just quickly. So if we go into VRRP and enable it, you'll see there's an ID number and a priority. So the ID can be anything between 1 and 255, and it's fairly arbitrary. If you have multiple VRRP setups on your network, of course, you do want to use unique IDs so that things don't get clustered improperly. However, if you just have 2 untangles, you can specify anything here, and it's not going to make any difference as far as the configuration or performance of VRRP is concerned. So we'll do 1, and then your priority. So the priority is actually how you dictate which device is master and which is the slave in the VRRP cluster or pair. You can have any number of slaves, but only one master. So if we set this to 1, that means that this device gets number 1 priority to the shared VRRP alias, which you add down here. And any number that's lower than that, so higher in the range, would then have to wait for this device to be down to get access to those resources. So if we were to set up a slave, as long as it's not 1, you can set, again, anything, and it's pretty arbitrary. So you can do 2, or you can do 15, whatever you want to do. And again, depending on how many devices you want in that cluster, as long as each one is given a different priority level with the same ID, they can all share that same set of aliases and take over resources in the event of a failure on one of the other devices. You can have multiple VRRP aliases configured, but generally speaking, you want to at least set 1 that is an IP address in your subnet on that interface that is not already in use on either the local network or on any of the devices in the VRRP cluster. So if I switch back here, copy that. We know that .10 is already in use. Let's assume that the other device is .11. So you can set the alias as .12. As far as configuration of the network is concerned, this would become your default gateway if we're at the edge. If we're doing DHCP, this would be the device that you would be getting as your default gateway. This would be the device that by default would be its DNS server. But as far as routing and all of that is concerned, if you need to define a route on any other system on your network that has to pass to or through the Untangle, you want to use this alias IP instead of the actual interface IP to make absolutely certain that everything is always working regardless of which device in the VRRP cluster is holding resources at the moment. Any questions before I switch back over to the slide deck and wrap things up?
I think most of the questions got answered. They were very specific questions. So I think we're pretty much good. Oh, someone did want to go over Untangle logs reporting. in terms of I was having issues finding out what was being passed or blocked in Untangle, and I wasn't able to find anything in reports.
Okay, so when we're talking specifically about network level reporting, let me switch over to that real quick. There is a separate section in the reports for layer 3 type reporting. Probably the best one to start with is the all sessions report. This is a running list of every session that is passing through the Untangle for the time period that you've specified. Obviously, there's a lot in here, so you absolutely want to make certain that you're using as many conditions as possible to narrow down what you're looking for. So if you've got a specific machine that maybe you're trying to set up a port forward, you could actually come in here, add a condition for client, and set that as the public IP address that you're coming from on that port forward. And then the report would automatically be refiltered and then list only the traffic coming from your machine. Alternatively, if you set it to server, and again specify an IP address, you can then look to see, okay, did my traffic actually get to the intended internal machine via my port forward? So then you can specify the internal IP address of your server, of your machine, whatever it happens to be, and again, it'll refilter it, just showing you that traffic. Personally, I'd recommend that you actually use both when you're wanting to test whether or not a port forward is working, because seeing traffic that's specific between those two devices, those two IP addresses, is the only way to really tell for sure whether or not it's working. Outside of this, there's also some really, really great troubleshooting tools that can help with troubleshooting most of what we've covered today, as well as some additional things above and beyond what we've covered today that we're actually going to go into here in just a minute. Are there any other questions that we can talk about, or was that the only one?
No, I think that's about it. We've answered all the other questions.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and switch back over to our slide deck and talk about troubleshooting. So in Config Network, there is a troubleshooting tab that has several different utilities to help you in determining where a problem may or may not be, both on the Untangle and on either side of the Untangle, depending on what you're working on. We've got a session viewer. We have event reports. The event reports being like the all sessions report that I just showed you a moment ago. The sessions viewer is very similar to the all sessions event report, with the exception that it is all active sessions currently passing through the Untangle. So if there's something happening right now at this moment, you can go into the sessions viewer and very quickly filter that view down instead of trying to find it in a report. But even outside of those two, these troubleshooting utilities gives you the ability to do additional testing, like pings, like verifying that DNS resolution is working, like making sure that a port is open. And I'm doing these in order: ping test, DNS test. Connection test is a simple telnet. It's verifying whether or not you can reach the specified IP address on the specified port. That works both inbound and outbound, by the way. So you can test to see whether or not the Untangle can reach your mail server on port 25. If the Untangle can't reach it, then your port forward's not going to work. So that's an excellent way to verify where a problem may exist if your port forward doesn't work. There's also a trace route test, as well as a download test to test your speeds passing through the device. And then, of course, lastly is the packet test. The packet test is probably one of the most powerful tests that are available in this tab, because you can actually do a live packet capture of the traffic as it's traversing through the Untangle to or from your network. And you can be as specific or generic using this test as you want to. If you've ever used packet scanning software like Wireshark, or if you're familiar with Linux in general and done a TCP dump, it's the same sort of thing. It's showing you all the information that's held inside those packets as they're passing through the Untangle. So you can very easily and quickly identify, am I seeing this traffic or am I not seeing this traffic? If I'm seeing it, is it going where it's supposed to go? As we've said before, there's probably a million things that we didn't cover here today that may or may not have come up in questions. Anything that you can think of that you need help, you have questions about, can we do it, can't we do it? There's several different avenues for you to reach out to us and quickly and easily get those questions answered. Try our forums, check out the knowledge base, check out our wiki. Lots of different documentation in there.
Eric, do you want to show people where they can access those, the forums, the
Absolutely.
knowledge base, and the wiki?
Absolutely. Yep. So let's do, our wiki is at wiki.untangle.com. For the most part, we do try to keep this as similar a layout as we can to what you actually see in the admin UI, so it's easy to find things. And all of these also are directly linked in the Untangle dashboard as well when you are in the different parts of the Untangle system. And they'll take you directly into the related part of the wiki. Our knowledge base, support.untangle.com. In here, you can find articles, how-tos, FAQs, just a bunch of general knowledge about how different aspects of the Untangle work. There's a lot of documentation in here about our different applications, use cases, configurations. As well as reports and command center and all of those things that don't necessarily have to do with configuring the Untangle itself, but are still a key part in using the Untangle. All can be found in the Untangle knowledge base. And then, of course, our forums, forums.untangle.com. This is an excellent resource to use. These are very actively moderated by a lot of people, actually. It's a very active forum. You've got a question, you've got an idea for something for how to use Untangle, ask it in here. Chances are excellent somebody else has either thought of similar or done exactly what you're trying to do, and they can help quickly guide you to getting that up and running as quickly as possible. So did we have any last minute questions before we wrap
There
things
was
up?
just a question, sorry, about how to view the session viewer. I think you kind of mentioned that already, that it's just...
I did mention it. I didn't actually show it. We can do that real
Okay.
quick. So sessions here at the top. You click that button. You see it's pretty similar to what we were looking at in the all sessions report. Some differences, there's a lot more information contained in this view, for sure. And this is all, again, this is all stuff that's happening right now passing through this device. You have the option to refresh it. You can filter it. You can add, remove columns, depending on what you're looking for. The other really useful part of this view is this detail on the side. You click on an entry, and it's going to show you information about what's actually happening on that session. And there's a lot of detail here.
Great, thanks, Eric. There were some questions about other applications in terms of VPN or captive portal and stuff, and we do have other, we have our YouTube channel, the Untangle YouTube channel, that has a ton of webinars on all of our applications and other topics that were kind of mentioned, whether it be VPN or captive portal, guest Wi-Fi, stuff like that. So please be sure to look at our YouTube channel, as well as keep an eye out for our upcoming webinars, as we like to continually cover those trendy topics. And let's see, we're gonna stay on just to see if there's any other questions that pop in, but if all of this sounds too much for you to handle, or you're not quite sure where to get started, or you want something very specific done on your configuration of Untangle, we do offer professional services. So if what Eric showed, or you are having some difficulties in support, or the forums are not able to help, consider our professional services, whether you're installing us for the first time or want to do something specific, or you're converting from one vendor to Untangle. We do help with that through the whole process. So please just consider that so that you don't get frustrated. And I believe that's it. We're going to stay online just for a little bit just to see if there's any other questions that pop in. But thank you, Eric, for the great demo. And if we didn't get to your question, or if you have a very specific question, support@untangle.com, sales@untangle.com. Eric mentioned the forums, the wiki, our knowledge base. We have tons of resources for you. We want you to be successful in your deployment of Untangle. So please contact us if that's not happening. We're here to help, and we're happy to help with what we can. So I'm going to stop the recording now. We're going to keep the questions open just for about 5 more minutes.